Pull the covers up, recline your chair, or set your car to cruise control, because you're listening to Nightmare Creatures Podcast. Tonight's guest is Elliot. He's calling all the way down from Florida. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us your story?
Hello, my name's Elliot. I understand you have a podcast about the supernatural, and, I guess my story has a lot to do with something that is known as spirit keeping. Spirit keeping is this, I guess you could call it a hobby that is I guess it's actually not very common. It's not a very common hobby at all. Not a lot of people know about spirit keeping, but you can go to websites such as Creepy Hollows or Starry One Night, or just type in spirit keeping on Google, and there's a lot of sites where it talks about spirits which are bound to vessels such as amulets, medallions, stuff like that witches sell online, or wizards for that matter. Anyway, I got into this practice of spirit keeping through a friend of mine who was I guess you could call him a wizard, warlock, witch, or whatever. He just practiced magic, I guess you could say. Anyway, he had a lot of spirit vessels that he bought from this witch on the internet. His name is Justin. And anyway, I got into spirit keeping at a time in my life for most of my adult life, from age 18 till now, I was actually devout Catholic, but sometime last year I had a falling out of my faith, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Or I guess you could say a loss of faith, a despair, I guess you could say.
Right, it happens to all of us.
Yeah, and essentially my attitude, because I think a lot of this is really important in regards to my loss of faith, but essentially my last prayer to God before renouncing my faith and everything like that was, God, I've been serving you for so long, and I feel like if your truth were really truly so important to me in my life, then I wouldn't be made to feel this way. Especially as long as I've served you, as long as I've loved you, I expect to find some sort of meaning in my life thus far. And I just felt kind of trapped in the place where I was, and I said, from now on, I'm just going to live for me. Anyway, I kind of, got lost into secular philosophy. My philosophy of choice that really helped me cope as an atheist at this point, because I was a really staunch atheist at this point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and
So you 100% lost faith completely.
Yeah, exactly. So I literally had a coworker. I used to be really into Jesus and everything like that coming up, and I guess my flame just kind of kept dying.
Yeah.
And it got to the point where I was just like, to hell with it. And I even told a coworker one time who was really religious, who had just started off. He was a young Earth creationist, which I really scoffed at, because even as a religious person, I didn't believe that the Earth was only 6,000 years old and evolution's a lie and all that. And I thought that was just absolutely silly. And anyway, I just told him flat out, I was like, he had all these hopes and everything about God in the afterlife. I just told him that was absolute bullshit. This life here is the only one that you're ever going to have. If you spend it worshiping some God that you can't even see, and you haven't seen your entire life, and you're going to be wasting your life here. And anyway, so absurdism really became my philosophy of choice. It's essentially where you create your own meaning in life, or the only meaning which there is in life is that which you ascribe to it, or I guess you could say that which keeps you from killing yourself is the meaning of life. It is the philosophy of Albert Camus.
Okay.
And I got really into Albert Camus and absurdism, and also to Friedrich Nietzsche, but to a lesser degree. And I really enjoyed as well Sam Harris. Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, was just pretty much... philosophy was kind of like my bread and butter. I mean, it was seen to me as how alchemy was the precursor to chemistry. Astrology was the precursor to astronomy. and religion the precursor to philosophy. So I got really heavy into philosophy.
Right.
Because it just seemed like the natural flow of things.
You were going through a transformation in yourself.
Yes, so I was just essentially letting go of everything that I once was to basically become somebody new.
Okay.
Anyway, but I always kept an open mind to the supernatural, I guess you could say, or paranormal stuff. I talked to a few psychics and mediums, and they do some interesting readings, I guess you could say, but I don't think there's anything concrete or objective that I could have derived from it to be like, okay, that was definitely legit.
Right.
I went to a few supposedly haunted cemeteries, and I didn't find jack diddly squat.
And that's usually the case.
Yeah, and pretty much everything I tried upturning that was supernatural was kind of a dead end.
Yeah.
And one day I went over to my friend Justin's house to play some Super Smash Brothers, and I noticed that he had a pendulum on his dresser. So I picked it up and was sarcastically like, are there any spirits here? And sure enough, that thing spun on its own in the clockwise formation for okay, whenever you use a pendulum is basically any weighted object dangling from a chain or a string. It's usually pointed if it's specifically made to be a pendulum, but literally anything could work as a pendulum. And anyway, I picked it up, I said, are there any spirits here? And the thing spun for yes. And I was absolutely flabbergasted because I knew that I didn't move it and that it had moved on its own. That spin of a pendulum was literally my first ever encounter with something supernatural. It's something that was so simple,
right?
But I couldn't trace it back to anything natural, and it absolutely turned my entire worldview on its head. And after my mind was just absolutely blown by this, I immediately asked my friend Justin, where he gets these amulets. I ended up ordering an amulet for myself. And whenever you look at spirit keeping sites, they look like absolute and total nonsense. I mean, it could, an amulet could range anywhere from $50 to $300.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and they all essentially claim to be imbued with the spirits of mythical creatures like vampires, kitsune, fairies, fays, or whatever.
Okay, so you have magical practitioners who are actually claiming to bind souls or spirits onto these objects?
Yeah, so essentially the idea is that the wizard or witch binds a spirit to the vessel in order to connect the spirit to the vessel.
Wow.
Magically, yeah. And of course, I always thought this was complete and utter nonsense until I had bought my first amulet. And the first amulet I bought was a supposed vampire spirit called itself Kavana.
Kavana, okay.
And anyway, I got a pendulum and I got an amulet, and I started asking this thing all kinds of questions whenever it finally arrived in the mail. And after asking it so many questions, I got I had more of I guess you could say a new age worldview.
Right.
I believe that we were all God, or we were all a part of God, or collectively we made God, and God is the universe, and that Jesus Christ was no more God than you or I, although he was a very enlightened person and teacher, etc., etc. And also too believed in reincarnation for the longest time, and astral projection and stuff like that. I mean, I guess, as far as reincarnation now, I don't really know how true that is. I don't think that there's any way to really know how true any of that stuff is, because there's no way to really personally experience it for yourself, I guess.
Right. It's definitely an interesting topic.
Yeah, it's definitely, definitely everything I was going off of. It's just kind of what the what the spirit was telling me.
Right.
And I noticed that there was a lot of red flags whenever I was like talking to the spirit. Like, for example, one time I asked it how tall it was, and it gave me this long story about how it was I think it was a 16th century Sephardic Jew that was apparently burned at the stake for being a Jew in Italy.
Wow. So, were you hearing this audibly, or was this? This was
all conversation through the pendulum.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah. I did not hear anything audibly from the spirit. Instead, it just kind of guided my pendulum to different letters and stuff like that.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, and so basically what you do is, in order to do that, you have to lay down letters, like on a piece of paper, and like write out the alphabet, and then you can you put the pendulum down on the piece of paper, almost like a Ouija board, except you use a pendulum to point to letters instead of an eyepiece. By the way, I also tried a Ouija board, and that turned out to be nonsense, but this worked.
I'll take your word for it.
Anyway, I was asking it all these different questions through the pendulum and everything like that, and eventually it got really tired of like answering all my questions and just stopped talking to me altogether. And it was actually a really funny instance with the spirit, but essentially I learned that like it had, I guess you could say, like boundaries, I guess you could say.
Okay.
Like it didn't want to just answer my questions all day. And it, red flags talking to it. So I asked it if various paganistic gods existed and stuff like that, and it said yes. And I really want to get into the practice of magic, since that was how I came upon this whole world of like spirit keeping in the first place. Because like, okay, clearly there must be some validity to magic if I'm able to, talk to a spirit in the afterlife and yada yada.
Right, 100%. If you're getting concrete evidence like that.
Yeah, so I started looking into magic, but the more I looked into magic, the more it looked like it was a bunch of nonsense too. Like, if you look up a lot of spells and enchantments and whatever stuff like that, it literally just sounds like just basically a bunch of nonsensical rhymes.
Okay.
Like, literally like some Cinderella bippity boo, I turn you to poo type of stuff. Like, literally that basic form of speech could be considered a spell. And I asked the spirit, I was like, is this all just a bunch of nonsense? And it just said yes. And that really threw me for a loop. I was like, if all of this is nonsense, then how is it that you're able to be bound to an amulet?
That's a good question.
And, anyway, so one day I painted a picture of it, from what it described that it looks like, which would be, this was actually one of the interesting things. I asked, like, what color its hair was. It said brown. That's what color its eyes were. It said brown. That's what color its skin was. It said, light brown.
Okay.
And, I asked how tall it was, though, and it said 9 feet tall.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, what?
9
And it said yes on the pendulum. And I was like, you're a 16th century Sephardic woman. And it said yes. I was like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And it said, wait, 4 feet tall.
And this pendulum is moving to where you cannot mistake this for an outside stimuli. This is 100% moving by its own volition.
Yes and no. I think that it is kind of contingent on the subtle movements of your hand and body.
Okay.
But at the same time, I do not believe that the person using the pendulum is the one influencing what it says.
I get what you're saying. So without leading you, it's working through you. Is that what you're trying to say?
Essentially, yeah. Because, yeah. And a large part of the reason why I know that is because a lot of times it would point to letters or would throw out phrases that I would not expect it to do, and also too at times it would interact with the world around me, and also too at times with me, so I knew it was there.
Okay, that was very interesting.
But anyway, one day I was painting a picture of it, and I forgot how it got my attention. I think it brushed me or something like that. I don't know. Like, spirits, they have this weird thing where they can like brush you, and you'll feel kind of like a tingle on the side of your face or on your head or something like that.
Yeah, I've heard about that before.
Or you'll feel like on your arm or something like that.
Right.
And I asked it what was wrong, and it spelled out the word lies. And I was like, "What's a lie?" And it said picture. And anyway, I was like, "What are you talking about? I thought you said this is what you look like," and it just spelled out lies, and then it said true form. It spelled out the words true form. And I was like, what do you mean true form? And it spelled out lights, and I was like, "You want me to turn the lights off?" And it said yes. And anyway, it took me a long time to get around to turning off the lights, because I was kind of scared of what might happen.
Oh yeah.
And so, like, I just basically sat there, like, laying on my bed. I was just laying on my bed and holding the pendulum, just contemplating whether or not I should turn off the light, because I know that whenever I do turn off the light, it's going to show me its true form, and I'm afraid of what that might entail. So, anyway, I'm laying down, and I almost fall asleep. And then it, like, shakes both sides of the bed next to my head to wake me back up, and then spells out lights again.
Ooh, so it's getting aggressive at this point.
Yeah, pretty much. And anyway, so I get up, and I turn off the lights, and suddenly I feel like this gush of wind, like, go towards the center of my room, into my bed, into the center of my bed. And I can kind of see the silhouette of, like, this really lengthy figure that's also, too, very low to the bed, that has 8 appendages and, like, piercing red eyes. And it didn't really finish manifesting before I started to leave the room. And, like, I put the lights on, ran into the bathroom, and went out to the back porch and lit up a cigarette, shaking.
I'd be right there with you, buddy.
Yeah, so, anyway, I started telling my friend Justin about this. I was like, because he has this thing, claims to be a vampire and everything like that. And I asked him how you go about becoming a vampire in the next life, and he says, "Oh, by rejecting natural death." And so I started talking to this thing, and I'm still under the pretense at this point that it used to be a human being.
Right.
And anyway, I get to talking to it, and it basically says that that it's miserable. It says that it says something about its skin oozes urine and something like that. There's always an awful smell.
Ooh.
Yeah, and anyway, I felt really bad for it. I was like, it said something like, "God's light is my darkness." And I asked it, I was like, "Kavana, are you in hell?" And it said no. And I asked it a second time, just extremely sincerely, I was like, "Are you in hell?" And it said yes. And at this point, my heart kind of sank, because honestly, this thing wasn't really bad to me in any way. I did not feel as though it deserved to be in hell, whatever it was. And I asked it if it saw a light, and it said yes. I was like, "Can you go towards the light?" And it rapidly said no. It won't go towards the light.
Wow.
And so my goal at that point was essentially to get it to, I guess, change its state of being and not refuse what I perceived to be natural death, as it put it. Then Christmas rolled around. On Christmas Day, it spells out, Elliot needs to go back.
Okay.
And I'm like, "What do you mean Elliot needs to go back?" And it says, "Jesus says that Elliot needs to go back." For Jesus himself to say Elliot needs to go back, presumably to Catholicism.
Okay. That's how you interpret it.
That really threw a wrench in all of my plans because, one, I didn't want to go back to being Catholic because it's a very restrictive religion.
Right.
And that's not really the kind of life that I wanted to live for myself. And also, too, that would cause problems with the whole magical world of spirit keeping that I had just gotten into.
Yeah.
And so I really didn't want to go back to Catholicism. I had essentially made an agreement that, I would try and go back to Catholicism, and in the meantime, we would have to find a way to unbind the spirit from the vessel. And so that she would, go, back to God and everything like that.
Right.
Or the great light or whatever it is that she was avoiding. And essentially, it came to be that it just made it vehemently clear that that was not a possibility. And it's basically refusing. Anyway, because I used to work night shift, one morning after work, I was talking to it. I said, and I was like, do you think that I'll be able to go to heaven whenever I die? And it said no. And I asked if I'll go to hell, and it said no. And by the way, it's very adamant that there is no hell.
Huh.
It was essentially the idea is that there was 7 astral planes.
Yeah.
And it was on the 6th astral plane.
Okay.
And I am on the 7th, and God is on the 1st.
Did you get this information from this entity?
Yeah, this is essentially what the entity was telling me.
Okay. And have you done any type of research on your own about this, or what do you believe?
What do I believe now? Now I am formally Catholic again. I believe in heaven, hell, and purgatory, and everything else is kind of speculation.
Right. So you think that it could have been leading you into a false sense of security?
Yeah, actually I do, going back at it, but I do believe that the creature was in hell. Okay. And now, the thing about there being 7 astral planes, essentially, I guess you could say it comes from the idea that, every plane is, I guess, a different wavelength of vibration. Right. And the higher your frequency, the closer you are to God, which is actually the source and origin of all the other astral planes.
Yeah.
So, and that's why God is categorized as being on the 1st plane, and we're categorized on being on the 7th, whereas, a lot of people, because I did do some research after the Spirit told me all this. Mm-hmm. But, because, of course I thought, astral planes were just some new age mumbo jumbo at the time. But I went back and looked at it, and there's a lot of work in there from, Kabbalists and stuff like that. And I think even Aleister Crowley, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and a lot of occultists talk about these things called astral planes. Essentially, the idea is that the higher your frequency is, the closer you are to God, and the lower it is, the further you are from God. Being physical creatures on a physical world, I guess our frequency would be the densest, and she would be on the 6th astral plane, which would make hers slightly lighter than ours, I suppose.
Well, I gotta say that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense, but I digress. I don't know. I don't have any understanding of this stuff whatsoever.
Right.
And that's another thing I discovered too is a lot of people who claim to have a lot of esoteric knowledge about occult stuff and life after death and all that. They really have no idea what they're talking about. And I learned that they really have no idea what they're talking about the hard way. Because, that gets to the end of the story, really. Anyway, I asked the creature, I was like, how do you, I asked it if I could go to heaven, and it said no. I said, do you think I'll be stuck in hell? And it's like, there's no hell, idiot. I already told you this. Anyway, and then it was I was like, well, do you think I'll be happy whenever I'm in the afterlife? Because also, too, it rolled out reincarnation as a possibility. It said I won't be able to reincarnate either.
Okay.
And I asked it how it knew that I would be happy in the afterlife, and it said, because I'm a monster too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which basically implies that it turned my soul into a monster, and I started freaking out. I couldn't even sleep that night.
I know this whole event, in dealing with this, must have took a real toll on you.
Yeah, it really did, honestly. It was probably the scariest thing that I had ever been through, but at the same time, though, I'm really glad I had these experiences.
Yeah, definitely.
Because now I know that kind of stuff is real.
Yeah.
And anyway, so I started talking, essentially I started asking, was this true? And it said yes. And I was really panicky because I didn't want to spend the rest of my eternity as a monster. With, piss, skin oozing, piss oozing out of my skin.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I asked it if this is reversible, and it said no, monster forever. And then I asked, in the name of Christ, is this true? And I think I invoked the name of Christ because I was in such a desperate situation. I was really the only thing that I could think of off the top of my head.
Right.
And whenever I invoked the name of Christ, it gave me a contrary answer to what it was saying the whole time. It said, no, it is reversible. Anyway, I said, in the name of Christ, how do you reverse it? And it said, it spelled out good behavior. And I don't really know how true the rest of it was. But I asked how much good behavior it would take. And it said, 1 year of good behavior. And I asked, what if I was just an absolute saint? And it said 1 day. And I guess essentially, I don't know. I think there was some truth to that, but anyway, I called up my friend Justin. I was like, hey, Justin, I didn't really say you're a spirit, but I was like, Kavana says that she turned me into a monster. And anyway, he's like, oh, it's just messing with you, dude. And I'm like, no, Justin, I think that it's serious. And I was really freaking out at the time. I was like, I think I was on the verge of tears, actually. I was like, I really don't want this thing anymore. Can you please take this from me? And he's like, yeah, sure, dude. Come by the house and drop it off. So I drove down to his house and dropped off the amulet, and was just kind of hoping that was the last of it.
Yeah.
Anyway, after a while, I think this whole episode is over. And, anyway, I started trying to teach my friend, one of my friends how to practice divination. Because it was just a really cool thing that I had picked up. And I was like, I had been divinating a little bit here and there with just a pendulum without the amulet.
Right.
And I thought I was just talking to rando spirits and everything like that. And everything was copacetic. Anyway, one day I was sitting down with my friend Cody. And I was saying, I was talking to a bunch of what I thought were a bunch of different spirits. And I said, and we got a new spirit on the line. I was like, who it is? And it spelled out Kavana.
Ah.
And that really freaked me out because I thought I was just absolutely done with that whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I ended up going home immediately after that. And I was like, what are you doing here? And I think it spelled out the words possessed or something like that.
Oh.
Yeah. And anyway, I think it got to a point where I forgot how it got to the point, but I asked it, I basically broke down. I was like, were you ever, I said, in the name of Christ, were you ever human at all? And it said no.
So it was lying to you the whole time.
Yeah, it was essentially a lie the entire time. The entire time it was just basically a flat out demon. I told this to my friend Justin, and anyway, he buries the spirit vessels. And I make every effort to go back to my religion at this point. I have been, just praying the rosary every day. I've been reading the scriptures and the saints and trying to fall in love with Jesus again. And eventually, I felt it come back. And, you know, so I just forged a pendulum, I think with my car keys or something like that. And I'm like, what are you doing back?
Yeah.
And it said visiting. I was like, are you attached to me or anything like that? And it said, no. You've been keeping me away pretty well.
Oh.
And I was like, well, what's been keeping you away? And it said, pretty much everything.
Everything that you were doing?
Yeah, everything that I was doing. Like, I was watching this video from this exorcist, and he talked about how it's the ordinary things that keep back the extraordinary. And essentially the idea is that, you know, simple things like prayer and studying the scripture, attending mass and going to confession, all these ordinary forms of spirituality is what kind of keeps at bay the extraordinary. So once I got into like a more ordinary form of worship and everything like that, my interactions with that spirit kind of subsided. I guess that wraps up the first story. There is kind of a part 2 to this whole thing, but and I think that's actually a pretty good stopping place. But you know, that was kind of the end of the Kavana saga. So.
All right. Well, I really appreciate you calling in, and just as soon as we get another chance, we're going to get you back on the phone.
All right, man. Sounds like a plan.
All right. Thank you, and have a great night.
You too, bud.
That concludes part 1 of Elliot's fascinating story. Thanks for stopping by Nightmare Creatures Podcast. And remember, there's no such things as fairy tales.